Hi. I want to begin by thanking everyone for this invitation to speak with you today about the Karrabing Film Collective, our films, and the methodology and some of the conceptual background of the way we make films and think about films and what we intend our films and our installations to do. What I thought I'd do today is talk about a dominant division in Western aesthetic sense between fiction and nonfiction, and especially think about this division between fiction and nonfiction when we're also thinking about the contemporary toxic conditions of climate change and climate collapse. And I want to use, in particular, I want to use a few films from the Karrabing Film Collective as an example, but also a short animation film I made during the shooting of our first film, our first Karrabing film, When the Dogs Talked. And this short animation is called The Origins of Bigfoot. What I hope to do and provide by the end of this talk is a suggestion about the ways in which the Karrabing Film Collective seeks to intervene and interrupt this Western aesthetic division between fiction and nonfiction that doesn't simply function in the arts, but functions as a mode of governing First Nation and Indigenous worlds. So let me start by giving a brief summary of a few concepts that are essential to both myself as a thinker with the Karrabing and a member of Karrabing, but also a few concepts that are central to the collective as a whole. Now, these concepts are, the three concepts I'm going to talk about are Karrabing itself, Gianto power, and the ancestral present. So that's Karrabing, Gianto power, and the ancestral present. So let me begin with Karrabing. We're called the Karrabing Film Collective, or we call ourselves Karrabing or Karrabing Mob or Karrabing Family. And Karrabing, K-A-R-R-A-B-I-N-G, is both a word and a concept. As a word, it's part of the Emiangle language, and it refers to when the tides of the vast coastal region of Karrabing families is at its lowest. So when the tide goes as far out as it's going to go and is set to return to the shore. Karrabing is matched by another Emiangle word, karakal, and that's when the tide is at its highest and set to return out to sea. Both of these terms present different and describe different ecological conditions, both of which are fantastic. So when Karrabing tide, the tide is most out, the reefs, the water holes, the mangroves both show the underwater geography of the region and also allow people access to places they can't get and foods they can't get when the tide is up. But when the tide is up, of course, you can fish. So both of these, there's no negative connotation, say in English, between low tide and high tide. But Karrabing is also a concept. And it's a concept meant to intervene and interrupt in settler methods of recognizing indigenous lands and families. In a settler mode of recognition that from a settler point of view is thought of as positive, like the settler is recognizing Indigenous culture, Indigenous spirituality, Indigenous modes of belonging to land in the more than human world. Indigenous lands are separated from each other. So a group of families are seen to belong to a specific bounded piece of land based on their kinship to an ancestral totem, right? So this family has an ancestral totem in this land, and that family has an ancestral totem in that land, and etc. So settlers treat Indigenous relations to land as if they were property holders, as if they were small nations, as if they were divided between each other, much like Australia is separated from New Zealand, or the US from Mexico, or Germany from Italy, or the EU from Turkey. Well, Turkey's in the EU. But you get the drift, is that the idea of a boundary and a people. Karabing, again, as a word that means when the tide is at its lowest, is also a concept that insists that while everyone in Karabing, all the families in Karabing, have their own lands, their own totems, their own language. So in Karabing, we have the Wajigan language, the Emianga language, Mendha language, Kiuk, many languages, many totems, stretched across a vast coastal landscape. Karabing insists, just like the tide, that one has one's own lands because of the ways that they are connected by these ancestral travels, by their ancestors, these more than human totems that moved across the land, did things in particular places, imprinted the land in a very specific way so you can see the shape of those ancestors, and moved on. So Karabing as a concept busts open this settler logic of property by saying the lands are connected foundationally. It's the connections that allow people to have separate lands. So that's Karabing as a concept. Gianto power, G-O-N-T-P-O-W-E-R, Gianto power, geos, ontology, power, crammed together, is a mode of governing existence from the West. So it's a Western way of thinking about and governing existence based on the division between life and non-life. Not life and death, life and non-life. On the life side is death. That is, life is defined in the Western imaginary based on those things that are able to be born, to grow, to reproduce, and die. And in Western philosophies, death or finitude is what founds ethics and politics. What will I have been? What will I have potentiated at the end of my life? On the other side, non-life, in the West, is this imaginary of inert things, things that don't have an indwelling potential to grow, to reproduce, and to die. Think of rocks. Think of sandbanks. You can even think of wind in this way. What's important about this Western division between life and non-life is that it's a very old concept in the West, say stretching back to the Greeks. But during settler colonialism, from the 15th to the 17th century and onwards, it was weaponized. This division was weaponized by organizing different colonized people according to how lively they were versus how stone-like. So that in the colonization of Australia, Indigenous peoples were described as Stone Age people. Why? Because this division between life bios and non-life geos was used to organize a relation between a settler who was, they considered themselves, because it was a way of weaponizing their own invasion at the height of civilization, and Indigenous people as most stone-like. Now, what's interesting at the moment is that this division of this Western epistemology, this Western ontology, that existence is itself divided this way, is in the wake of climate collapse, toxic climate, so climate toxicity, right? The heat, which is literally boiling and racing seas. This division is not working anymore for the West. Right? So suddenly the West itself is saying, oh my God, like, not only is this division not true, that, the idea of Gaia means that non-life is inside of life and life is inside of non-life, but this division is itself part of the problem. And thus you see in the arts, a lot of the Western curatorial arts, but many artistic projects and museums and exhibitions turning to First Nation, Indigenous, Native people and asking them to help the West rethink how to be in relation to the more than human world. And indeed, you see a lot of both in governmental and artistic and academic context, such as this one. One turns to Indigenous knowledges and asks, do you Indigenous folks have a way for us to rethink our relation to, sometimes they use the word nature or existence or the more than human world, such that we can live more sustainably. And this is where the third concept comes in, that is the ancestral present. Not the ancestral past, but the ancestral present, which, as I'm going to suggest, brings all three perspectives together. Why the ancestral present? Well, from a Karrabing point of view, from our film collective, in our films, in our installations, it has become increasingly important to foreground the fact that the ancestors, both human and more than human, both like literally people's ancestors, human ancestors, but also the ancestral beings that shaped the landscape as they moved, in a way that I was talking about when I talked about Karabing. That the Karabing, us, and those ancestors always live and continue to live in the same material present. That is, there's not the ancient past and the foreboding future and us caught between, but rather time itself is sedimentations of action. It's ancestrally present. Now, we often try and think of examples to make this easier for folks to think about. And one of the examples that we've been using is that of shell middens. And I'm not sure if folks know what a shell midden is, but a shell midden is a place on a beach, usually, where humans eat seafood, seashells of all sorts, oysters, sea snails, you name it, clams. And over time, over centuries and centuries, the left behind shells slowly build up. Now, in the context of Karrabing lands, this building up of shell middens is 50,000 years old. And so over that time, and today you can see that the shells, some of the shells, the most recent ones, of course, just look like they were eaten yesterday. And then some look like they were eaten 50 years ago, and some are now crumbled. And you think, what kind of shell is it? You can't really tell anymore. And some of those shells are sand. That is, the ancestral present is the mingling of all of that time, that 50,000 years, materially in one place, but composed of different forms. And thus, if we want to think about the ancestral present that might help us, we have to remember that the ancestors, the sandbanks, the seashells, and us are all struggling together now against toxic climate change. Okay, so let me turn to the main topic I want to talk about today, which is fiction and nonfiction in the methodology of Karrabing arts. In the shadow of these concepts. And remember that what we're trying to do is think how Karrabing interrupts and intervenes in the easy way in which we exhibit fiction or nonfiction, especially when Indigenous and First Nation groups are asked to contribute to curatorial projects interested in climate change, climate collapse, toxic capitalism, and etc. So I want to begin with the first film we made, When the Dogs Talked, which we finished in 2014, and compared to a little short animation film I made for one of my nephews in Karabing, Ricky Bionamu. Okay, so just a short little couple of statements to give you some context about When the Dogs Talked, and give a summary of what it's about, and then I'm going to show a little clip before I talk more about it. So When the Dogs Talked was our first film. It's when Karrabing really was becoming a film collective. And it was in the context of the Karrabing being homeless at the time and living in tents because of divisions that had erupted in their community of birth, because of the way in which the settler state divided Indigenous people based on this property idea. And there's material online, you can learn more about what happened. But we decided to make our first film, and the first film was going to be about the way in which there was overcrowding in the cities, the tension and difficulty of being Indigenous in these Australian cities, and Darwin in particular. And also the difficulties of being in the bush in one's traditional lands because of these large cattle stations, ever developing residential suburbs. So the film is about a group of people, a group of Karrabing who are looking for Gigi Lewis, who, if they don't find her, they're going to lose their lease in the city and they're going to become homeless. And so they're traveling from Darwin 3.5 hours down into the bush looking for her. And they ultimately end up with other members of the family who are doing a project that are mapping the ancestral travels of their dog totems. So let me just show a little clip, and it's when the group who are mapping the ancestral travels of the dogs arrive at one place where these ancestral dogs were trying to make a fire in order to cook their cheeky yams.
Buena.
Turn in now. Turn in, all right.
What put that dream in?
Dreaming in blood, robbing a country.
Did it happen after the dinosaur or before? What?
Him like a dinosaur time, and it that bujut,
Huh?
well, old people in Ukraine there.
Harry, what do you think been make this whole here? Imagine what you think from Dingo got that little poor man love and rubber got a stick.
No, he was like a man, and then he roomed it like that, and then he just turned into.
Yeah, must be from man, bro.
Yeah, and then he just turned into a dingo.
Must be made from man first, then we turn Dingo big one now.
No.
Must be from machine been dig this hole.
Or like it was probably loose, and it was probably loose, and people just probably lifted the rock dog.
I don't think so. I don't think so. You can think that way. But you should listen to the story, what they've been telling about this whole.
But it could only work when the people just rubbed it like that.
Yeah, that dingo been doing. We in it, we call him dingo and make him like Robin, make him old.
How? It doesn't make any sense.
It doesn't make sense.
No, it doesn't.
Something must be from ghosts.
I'm sick of this shit now. Long with talking for the same thing.
It's good.
And why did you come, Ricky? Well, if you should say everybody's thing. Instead of being bad, sitting there like a dumb person.
Yeah, that's funny. Hey, why you talk but make me laugh now you must be. Oh my
It's
God.
not funny, it's real. It's real.
Yeah.
Oh,
Very
actually. Holy monkey.
Okay, so that little clip is based on something that actually happened when we took those kids to that dog site for the first time. And what we did when we were shooting When the Dogs Talked is that we told the kids just to repeat the arguments and the discussions they had when they first saw those dog holes. Now, when we first showed this film in 2015 down in Melbourne, Australia, we were asked a bunch of questions about the genre of the film. Was it fiction or nonfiction? Or was it ficto-doc? Linda Yerwin, who's a member of the Karrabing, she's Emmy Engel, she said, well, it's a true story with a little, it's true, but with a little story added on. Now we can think of even someone like Aristotle, who made a distinction between tragedy and history by saying that tragedy is far more interesting than history because history only says what happened, whereas tragedy says what would or always will be happening, even if the exact details are not what happened from a historical point of view. And that's how we make all of our films. That is, we've all grown up together. We've known each other, well, since they've known each other since they were born. I've known the oldest members of Karabing since they were like 12 and 14. And, you know, we've all known each other for almost 40 years now. So our stories are based on things that actually happened. But as Linda Yerwin says, we put a little story in it. We fictionalize it a little bit. Okay, now, when we were making When the Dogs Talked, and we were out bush, we're, you know, in the setting that you saw in that little clip, we were camping out in tents, and there was a tremendous flu going around, and we were all kind of sick, very sick. I had a terrible sore throat. But at night, we were sitting around, you know, a fire, and we were doing what we do when we're out bush. We were telling stories about the ancestral landscape. So the older people, of which I'm one, were telling all the stories about all the human and more than human ancestors, like those dogs, which formed the land. One by one, everyone started going, to sleep. They wandered to their tent and they snuggled up and everybody's sleeping. And only Ricky Bianamu, one of my nephews, and I remained at the fire. And I said, okay, Nambeen, which is Emiengo for nephew, I'm really sick. I need to go to bed. I'm really tired. And he said, no, come on, Auntie, one more story. And I said, we've told all the stories. And I said to him, I have something new we can do. You ask me a question and I'll answer it. And then we'll go to bed. And so he did. He asked me, is Bigfoot real? And I said, yes, that's easy. Can we go to bed? And he said, no, wait. If Bigfoot is real, where did Bigfoot come from? So I want to show you this very short, little over a minute animation I made for him answering his question.
Started a long time ago. Then there were just two kind of people, Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. The way I heard it, no one knows where the Homo sapiens came from. The Neanderthals were just sitting there, minding their own business. Anyways, it went on and on like this for a while, till the whole world was nothing but blood. Somehow, one family escaped and found themselves up against a huge swamp. The old people said they had two choices, die or go into the swamp. Everybody wanted to go into the swamp. But the old people said, if we go into the swamp, we'll have to walk in the night because they'll have the light of day. And if we go into the swamp, we'll have to grow our hair long because they'll have the warmth of the fire. And if we go into the swamp, we'll have to eat our food raw because they'll have the dryness of fire. Some people say they went into the swamp and became Sasquatch. Other people say they became an enormous porcupine and one day would shake off the Homo sapiens. All I know is, once we did it to the Neanderthals, we started doing it to each other.
Why do I want you to think about the origins of Bigfoot in relation to when the dogs talked? It's because the origins of Bigfoot raises the questions of the division between fiction and nonfiction in a way that puts pressure on even, say, fictodoc, right? So documentary, and then we have fictodoc, right? But when the origins of Bigfoot put a whole nother twist on it. And it puts a twist on it, even when we think about the fact that within Karrabing, there are multiple perspectives on any event that happens. So I'm going to turn to our third film, Wuthar, or Saltwater Dreams, just to give you a little bit of a sense of how within Karrabing, there are different perspectives on the cause of any event. So Wuthar, or Saltwater Dreams, is based on something that really happened, like all of our films. A bunch of us were out boating across a large bay to the south side of this bay where a lot of the totems of Karrabing lie in the seas, and the coastal region stretches out. And we reached the southern side. It's about 2.5 hours to get across this huge bay. It's indigenous land, so there's no residential communities. There's nothing. There's lots, but there's no infrastructure in the Western sense, or what people like to call the modern sense. About 4 of us got off the boat and we were looking for a water hole. So we went off, we got off the boat, we had a shotgun, and we went walking. The rest of everybody stayed on the boat and they went down the shore to go fishing. Now, when we came back from looking for this water hole, the boat was not in sight and the sun was going down and we were all worried because, where's the boat? And eventually the boat came back and we were told the boat broke down. And as we boated, and then the boat started working again. And as we boated back across the bay to an outstation near to where we made When the Dogs Talked, a light argument broke out about what caused the boat to break down. So here's a clip from Wu Thought, or Saltwater Dreams, that shows 3 perspectives on why the boat broke down.
Well, I don't know what's wrong with the motor. How come not to put them there? Which one wire been burned? Or what time? I think this wire been burned one of them stuff, brother. That's what we die of.
Rex, you can't start him that boat.
I'm ready to start. We just gonna switch on that wire.
You can't start that boat.
What's wrong?
You ever looked at 3-star? On top we will light him out flare.
What's
On
wrong?
top.
They're from Saltwater. We hit him up that wire.
If you have keep think that he'll start.
All problem we the bush. All everything for a chimmer, cockle, all everything. All everything. Woman. Watch them break down the more enough from them. All people here.
You wanna believe in that old people thing? Give me, they're gonna help him. You gonna start him that boat.
Who got ancestors here? Like place country here.
But put your faith in the Lord, it will start.
Well, I got faith in my heart too, Lord Jesus.
I don't know about Lord, but I know about wiring.
So as you can see, within Karabing, there can be arguments about whether ancestors are the cause of events, just ordinary mechanical systems are the cause of events, broken motors, or whether Jesus and Christian faith are the cause of events. In the end of Wu Thought, however, all 3 of these perspectives come together when Linda Yerwin, who's standing at the fence talking about Jesus and belief in the Lord, goes back in time to the ancestors and asks them why they didn't help get the motor to start again. And the ancestors say, you should have prayed to Jesus. But eventually the ancestors said, you should also have called out to us. So there's a meeting and a mixing of not only time as materiality, but perspectives of agency, mechanical agencies, ancestral agency, spiritual agencies. So let's take Wu Thought. Let's take When the Dogs Talked, which is about one of those ancestral agencies, which were the travels of the dogs, and put it in relation to the origins of Bigfoot. When I showed, or when I told Ricky Bianamu at that fire, when he asked me, like, okay, Auntie, if it's true, where did Bigfoot come from? And I told him the story, and then I made this little animation film for him. He said to me, that's interesting. Where is that story from? That is, what place is it located in? For instance, we know where the dogs stopped and tried to make a fire to cook their cheeky yams. We know where they went and ate the cheeky yams and lost their tongue. And we know where they came from, where they got the cheeky yams from. All of them, all these places are specific places with specific geographic features. That's what Ricky Bianamu was asking me. What's the place of the origins of Bigfoot? And I said to him, nowhere. And he said, oh, you just made it up. I said, yeah, I just made up this story. And he said, oh, that's nice. So it's not a true story. And here's where I want to put pressure. Not between the division between fiction and nonfiction per se, but the division between myth and history within nonfiction, or the way in which this idea of myth fractures the difference between history and fiction and how Karabing intervene in it. Saltwater dreams. When the dogs talked. All Karrabing films, as Linda Yerwin says, have true story underneath them that we fictionalize a little bit. Now, I've been talking or referring to true things that happened as, say, events in the present. So, for instance, we took those kids to that dog site and then we recreated it with a little bit of fiction in When the Dogs Talked. We went across this bay in a boat that broke down, and then we made a movie out of it. But there's another truth that Linda Yerwin and others in Karabing are talking about that are not events that happen, but rather, or not are events that happen, not events that happen to us, but events that happen that shape the landscape. Those dog travels, the ancestors that are actually in the country, such as Trevor Bionamu says when he's standing on the boats and says those ancestors were there, or the ancestors that follow Karabing around in particular forms depending on what their totem is. So let me show you a clip, short clip from The Jealous One, in which we use montage to show you the way in which these totems move with present day Karabing as they move across the landscape.
What for open come here like damn?
We jump in here, damn, we gotta be tunnel, we swim, come on, then the
You gotta be fucking kidding me. 300 fucking kilometers underground, we might fucking drown there
You
halfway.
can when you muddy, you can swim. You have when you dulp, you can swim like me. Come on.
Fucking hell. Come on, Gav, we just do it.
Nah, we're gonna die halfway in the underground.
what's at stake here? Remember Gianto power, in which human, I don't like civilizations, human societies were stacked during the colonial period as the division between life and non-life was weaponized to justify the invasion and dispossession of First Nation and Native and Indigenous lands. Remember that the human ancestors of Karabing were classified as Stone Age people with primitive thought, right? And their ways of analyzing, understanding, and belonging to their landscape based on the ways in which their more than human ancestors, like dogs or fish dreamings, like you saw that barramundi fish, not only moved across the land, but shaped it geographically, shaped it geologically. The shape still there and the presence of those ancestors still there. The analysis of the landscape as shaped by these ancestral events, these actual occurrences, were at best described by settler invaders as mythic, right? So a mythology of the landscape in which history was broken. So there's historical time and then mythological time. The question Karrabing, or the issue Karrabing films and installations tries to put in the foreground, is whether or not an exhibition, a Western audience, can understand these ancestral present truths, that hill, which is there with those water wells, that barramundi fish, which is somewhere where we know, which is a reef, is itself struggling to stay in place in the context of extractive mining, climate collapse, extending the way in which residential projects concretize earth, flatten it. Whether or not viewers can understand that these are not myths, that this is not some ancient spirituality, but truth. That is, as Linda Yerwin says, there's true story that we put a little true facts, true story. We say true story and then we put a little story on, but we're saying truth that we put a little, we fictionalize it a little. And that truth is both what we did, but also the truth of the ancestral landscape itself. And here I just close my remarks by suggesting the way in which this might alter, change, interrupt the way in which we exhibit films, for instance, the origins of Bigfoot, which we could say is like it's a fun little myth that, I came up with and around a fire, in which I'm trying to, think about the relationship between past forms of Homo sapiens and Neanderthals and within the metaphor of colonialism. So Homo sapiens as rampaging settler colonizers. But this isn't true in the way in which Karrabing films are true. That is the way in which The Jealous One is true, or hopefully you'll come to all our films and see The Mermaids is true. You see the zombies are true. That is, all of the stories that shape the land are true. They're present, they're material, they're sedimented. The origins of Bigfoot isn't true. It makes you think, but it's not true. So how do we exhibit films without sliding into the kinds of divisions that have not only characterized Western aesthetics, fiction and nonfiction, myth and history, but also are used to govern people within this geontological mode of weaponizing the difference between life and non-life. How does one in an audience not simply sit back and say, isn't that so interesting that they would believe that, but rather join with Karrabing and understand that this is the shape of the material world. And this is the ancestral present, which is composed of humans, human ancestors, and more than human existence. The ecology, but also the way in which that geography was shaped by dogs, by barramundi, by long yams, by whales, right? And is struggling to stay in existence in its form in the same way that the Karrabing themselves are attempting to keep their ancestral present strong and influential. Thank you.